The boy heard something he never should have heard, and the millionaire never saw it coming. It was the kind of quiet that fills a house like a ghost, the clock ticking relentlessly but feeling suspended in time. An empty chair sat by the grand window, gazing out at the gray sky over San Francisco, but no one ever sat there anymore. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're looking at an old photograph or remembering something you lost long ago. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise you, today's story will touch your soul. The silence in Richard Hale's mansion wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a presence unto itself, thick and suffocating as the fog that rolled in from the bay each evening. At 62, Richard had built an empire worth $13 billion through revolutionary software that connected the world, yet he remained the most disconnected man in San Francisco. His Victorian mansion perched high in Pacific Heights commanded views of the Golden Gate Bridge, but Richard hadn't looked at those waters in 3 years. Not since Emily died. Every morning at precisely 7:15, Richard's wheelchair would glide across the marble floors with mechanical precision. The accident had taken his legs 5 years ago, a drunk driver on Highway 101 who walked away while Richard never would again. But it was Emily's cancer that had truly paralyzed him. She'd fought for 2 years while his money poured into experimental treatments, private jets to European clinics, and consultations with the world's finest oncologists. None of it mattered. Emily slipped away on a Tuesday morning while Richard was reviewing quarterly reports in the hospital corridor, his phone pressed to his ear, discussing a merger that would add another $1 billion to his portfolio. The house remembered Emily's laughter, the way she'd hum Sinatra while arranging fresh flowers from the garden, how she'd leave little notes in his briefcase saying, "Come home early, I made your favorite." Now the garden grew wild and untended, windows sealed shut to keep the world at bay, and 27 antique clocks throughout the mansion had stopped at different moments, each marking another instance when Richard chose work over love, success over presence, control over connection. His assistant Miranda managed his empire remotely, fielding calls from Wall Street while Richard sat in his study, surrounded by screens displaying stock portfolios, cryptocurrency wallets, and real estate investments that generated millions in passive income. But wealth felt meaningless when you're drowning in regret. He donated $50 million to cancer research, established the Emily Hale Foundation, even funded a children's wing at UCSF. Yet nothing could purchase absolution from the guilt that consumed him like a slow-burning fire. The mansion's 23 rooms echoed with the ghosts of conversations never had, embraces never given, and time never reclaimed. Richard's world had become a fortress of solitude, where technology served every need except the one that mattered most: human connection. He was a prisoner in his own palace, wealthy beyond measure yet spiritually bankrupt, surrounded by every luxury except the one he'd lost forever. 8-year-old Eli Rodriguez lived in a different San Francisco entirely. His world existed in the Mission District, where the scent of fresh tortillas mingled with eucalyptus from Dolores Park, where neighbors knew each other's names and shared their struggles over steaming cups of café de olla. Eli's apartment occupied the second floor of a narrow Victorian that had housed 3 generations of his family, its walls painted in warm yellows and terracotta reds that caught the California sun and held it like an embrace. His mother Natalie worked double shifts at Mel's Diner on Lombard Street, her feet aching from 16-hour days serving tourists and tech workers who tipped in singles while discussing million-dollar stock options. She'd studied accounting at City College before Eli's father disappeared, leaving her to raise their son on waitressing wages and food stamps. Yet their small home radiated warmth that Richard's mansion could never purchase. Love letters from Eli's grandmother taped to the refrigerator, family photographs crowding every surface, and the constant aroma of beans and rice seasoned with hope and determination. Eli possessed an unusual quality for someone so young. He listened, not just to words, but to the spaces between them, to the silences that carried more weight than sentences. At school, he was the child who comforted others during recess, who shared his lunch with students who'd forgotten theirs, who somehow knew exactly what to say when teachers were having difficult days. His eyes held a depth that seemed ancient, yet sparkled with childlike wonder at simple miracles: rainbows after storms, dogs wagging their tails, old people sharing stories on park benches. Every afternoon, while Natalie served coffee and counted tips, Eli would walk through Golden Gate Park, collecting smooth stones and fallen leaves, talking to elderly strangers feeding pigeons, helping lost tourists find their way to the Japanese tea garden. He'd learned English and Spanish simultaneously, switching between languages with the fluid grace of someone who understood that communication transcended words. His backpack always contained a small Bible his grandmother had given him before she passed, its pages worn soft from countless readings, margins filled with her handwritten prayers in careful cursive. The city's rhythm flowed through Eli's daily life, the clanging of cable cars climbing steep hills, foghorns echoing across the bay, street musicians playing jazz outside tourist cafes, and the constant hum of life lived fully despite its challenges. He knew every vendor at the Mission Farmers Market, could identify which sourdough bread was freshest at Boudin Bakery, and understood that true wealth wasn't measured in bank accounts, but in the connections that make life meaningful. On a gray November afternoon, while chasing a wounded pigeon through Pacific Heights, Eli found himself standing before iron gates that seemed designed to keep the world out rather than welcome it in. The bird had fluttered into the untamed garden beyond those gates, and Eli's 8-year-old heart couldn't bear leaving an injured creature alone. The mansion loomed behind overgrown hedges, its windows dark and uninviting, but something drew him forward, not curiosity but compassion for whoever lived in such profound isolation. Richard first spotted the boy from his study window, a small figure in a faded red jacket moving carefully through the garden's wild growth, cupping something gently in his hands. It had been months since any human presence had crossed his property line, and Richard's first instinct was to activate the security system, to drive away this intrusion into his carefully constructed solitude. But something in the child's careful movements, the tenderness with which he handled whatever he carried, made Richard pause. When the doorbell chimed, a sound that hadn't rung in over a year, Richard's wheelchair hummed across marble floors with mechanical precision. He opened the door to find a boy with dark eyes that seemed to hold starlight, clutching a small bird with obvious care. The child's presence felt like sunlight attempting to penetrate heavy curtains, warm yet overwhelming to someone who'd lived so long in darkness. "Excuse me, sir," Eli said in a voice soft as morning fog. "I found this little bird in your garden. I think her wing is hurt, and I wanted to help her, but she needs somewhere safe to rest. Do you have a small box, maybe with some soft cloth?" Richard stared at this unexpected visitor, noting the boy's threadbare jacket, worn sneakers, and the genuine concern in his expression, not for trespassing or potential trouble, but solely for a creature in need. It had been so long since anyone had asked Richard for help with something that money couldn't simply purchase, something requiring actual human kindness rather than financial transaction. "Birds die," Richard replied curtly, his voice rusty from disuse in conversations that mattered. "Nature doesn't offer warranties or customer service. Take it to animal control." But Eli's expression didn't change. No disappointment, no judgment. Only patient understanding that seemed far beyond his years. "Sometimes when something is broken, it just needs time and gentleness to heal," he said quietly. "May I sit with her in your garden for a little while? I promise I won't disturb anything else." Something in those words struck Richard like lightning finding a conductor's rod. Emily used to say almost exactly the same thing about people, about relationships, about the broken things in life that required patience rather than quick fixes. The memory hit him so forcefully that his hands trembled on the wheelchair controls, and for a moment, the carefully constructed walls around his heart shifted slightly, allowing something dangerous to slip through: hope. Richard's first instinct was to slam the door, to retreat into the familiar safety of isolation where memories couldn't ambush him through innocent words spoken by strange children. But Eli remained standing there, not demanding entry or pushing for more than he'd asked, simply waiting with the kind of patience that suggested he understood something about time and healing that most adults had forgotten. "5 minutes?" Richard heard himself saying, the words emerging before his analytical mind could prevent them. The garden is private property. Don't touch anything except the bird." Eli's smile was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds, radiant yet gentle. "Thank you, sir." Sometimes 5 minutes is exactly enough time for a miracle. As the child settled beneath the gnarled oak tree that Emily had planted during their first year in the mansion, Richard retreated to his study but found himself unable to focus on the quarterly reports spread across his desk. Instead, he watched through the window as Eli sat perfectly still, whispering softly to the injured bird, occasionally stroking its feathers with one finger while humming a melody Richard couldn't identify but somehow found comforting. There was something unsettling about the boy's presence, not threatening but disruptive to the carefully ordered emptiness that had become Richard's existence. For 3 years, silence had been his closest companion, predictable and undemanding. Now the garden held a different quality of quiet, one filled with potential rather than loss, with presence rather than absence. When 5 minutes stretched to 15, then 30, Richard expected to feel irritated by this violation of his terms. Instead, he found himself hoping the boy might stay longer, that whatever fragile magic was occurring beneath Emily's oak tree might continue for just a few more moments. It had been so long since the mansion held any energy other than grief and regret. As afternoon faded to evening, Eli carefully placed the bird in a small nest he'd fashioned from fallen leaves, whispering what sounded like a prayer before standing and brushing dirt from his knees. He approached the window where Richard sat watching and pressed his small palm against the glass in a gesture that could have been goodbye or blessing. "She's going to be okay," Eli said, his voice carrying clearly through the sealed window. "Sometimes we just need to remember that we're not alone, even when everything feels broken." Then he was gone, disappearing through the garden gate like morning mist, leaving Richard to wonder if the entire encounter had been real or merely wishful thinking. But the small nest remained beneath Emily's oak tree, and for the first time in 3 years, the mansion felt less like a mausoleum and more like a home where something good might still be possible. That night, Richard's dreams were filled with the sound of children's laughter and the scent of flowers he thought he'd forgotten how to smell. When he woke, sunlight was streaming through windows that had been dark for so long he'd almost forgotten they could let in light. Something had shifted in his carefully constructed world of isolation. Something small, yet profound, like a single note that changes the entire melody of a song. Over the following weeks, Eli's visits became a rhythm Richard found himself anticipating despite his better judgment. The boy would appear each afternoon after school, sometimes with small offerings: a flower picked from the sidewalk cracks in the Mission, a smooth stone found in Golden Gate Park, a drawing made with colored pencils worn down to stubs. He never asked for anything in return, never mentioned Richard's wealth or the mansion's obvious luxury, never seemed interested in anything except sitting quietly in the garden and sharing stories about his day. Eli talked about his mother's customers at the diner, the businessman who always ordered the same coffee and pie but never looked up from his phone, the elderly woman who came in every Tuesday for soup and always left exact change plus a 50-cent tip, the construction workers who joked loudly but always cleaned up their tables completely. He spoke about school, about his friend Maria whose family had just moved from El Salvador, about Mrs. Chen who taught them mathematics and somehow made fractions seem like puzzles worth solving rather than problems to endure. But mostly, Eli talked about seeing, really seeing, the world around him, how the fog rolled over Twin Peaks like a slow-motion waterfall, how street vendors arranged their fruit in patterns that looked like rainbow mandalas, how elderly taxi drivers knew every shortcut through the city but also knew which passengers needed conversation and which required silence. His observations revealed a child who noticed details that most adults overlooked, who found beauty in ordinary moments that others dismissed as routine. Richard found himself sharing stories he hadn't spoken aloud in years, about building his first company in a garage in Palo Alto, about the night he met Emily at a charity auction where she outbid him for a painting simply because she thought it looked lonely hanging in the back corner, about business trips, where he'd call her from hotel rooms in Singapore or London just to hear her voice saying his name. The memories brought pain, but also something he'd almost forgotten: the warmth that comes from being truly known by another person. Gradually, the mansion began to change in ways that surprised Richard. He found himself opening curtains to let in natural light, where Richard had been spending increasing amounts of time as he processed the magnitude of the changes he'd initiated. "Mr. Richard," the letter began, "I've been thinking about that first conversation we had about flying, about seeing how all the separate pieces fit together into something bigger. What you're doing now is exactly that kind of vision, seeing how individual healing and community development and economic justice are all connected, refusing to treat them as separate problems that require separate solutions. I'm proud of you for choosing the harder path, for risking criticism in order to support changes that might benefit people you'll never meet. But mostly I'm grateful that 10 years ago you chose to trust a strange kid who showed up in your garden asking for help with a wounded bird. Everything that's happened since then has grown from that moment of connection, that decision to choose openness over fear, relationship over isolation. You taught me that wealth is only valuable if it creates opportunities for other people to flourish. Now you're taking that lesson to its logical conclusion, working toward a world where everyone has enough resources to help themselves and their communities thrive. That's the most radical generosity I've ever witnessed." As 2029 drew to a close, Richard Hale sat in Emily's garden on the anniversary of their first meeting, watching fog roll in from the Pacific, while reflecting on a decade of transformation that had altered not only his own life, but the lives of thousands of people whose stories had intersected with his through community centers, foundation grants, policy campaigns, and the countless small connections that create lasting social change. At 71, he remained confined to his wheelchair, though physical therapy and medical advances had restored enough strength in his legs to allow him to stand for brief periods and take halting steps with assistive devices. But the mobility he'd recovered was less significant than the political and spiritual movement he'd experienced, the journey from isolation to community that had given his life meaning he'd never imagined possible during his years of empire building. The evening air carried voices of children playing in the community center that occupied half of his former mansion, sounds of teenagers practicing music and rehearsing for a play they'd written about gentrification and housing justice in San Francisco. The garden itself had evolved into a demonstration project for urban agriculture, producing food for local families while teaching children about sustainability and environmental stewardship. But the deepest satisfaction came from knowledge that the work would continue and expand regardless of his personal involvement. The Emily Hale Foundation had trained dozens of community leaders to carry on its programs and advocacy efforts. The participatory philanthropy model had been adopted by foundations across the country. The policy campaigns he had supported were gaining momentum in state legislatures and Congress. Most importantly, the young people who'd grown up in foundation programs were now adults leading their own organizations, running for political office, and continuing the work of building economic democracy from the ground up. Eli, now pursuing a law degree while directing policy advocacy campaigns, was preparing to run for San Francisco Board of Supervisors on a platform that combined community development experience with structural analysis of inequality. As darkness settled over the city and fog transformed familiar landscapes into something dreamlike and mysterious, Richard found himself thinking about Emily in ways he hadn't for years, not the painful memories that had haunted him during his years of isolation, but gratitude for a love that had somehow survived death to become generative rather than merely nostalgic. Emily had always believed that individual success meant nothing unless it contributed to collective flourishing, that privilege carried responsibility to challenge systems that concentrated advantages rather than sharing them broadly. Richard's decade of learning had simply been the long process of understanding what she'd tried to teach him during their years together. That real wealth was measured in relationships nurtured and communities strengthened and systems transformed to serve justice rather than perpetuate inequality. The boy had heard something he never should have heard, the possibility that despair could be transformed into hope through connection, that isolation could become community through service, that individual healing could generate collective liberation when grounded in love rather than fear. The millionaire had never seen it coming. The recognition that his greatest fortune wouldn't be counted in dollars accumulated but in power shared, not in possessions acquired but in systems changed, not in success achieved but in relationships forged across lines of difference and inequity. And you? Have you ever met someone small who changed your life in an immense way? Maybe a child who asked exactly the right question when you needed it most, or a young person whose wisdom caught you off guard and reminded you of truths you'd forgotten. Tell me your story in the comments below. I believe every person listening has encountered at least one small angel disguised as an ordinary human being, someone whose presence shifted everything, even if you didn't realize it at the time. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like so I know it reached you. Subscribe to hear more stories about the unexpected ways grace appears in our lives, about the healing power of connection, about the truth that our deepest wounds often become the source of our greatest compassion. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that it's never too late for redemption, that love really does find a way to transform even the most impossible circumstances. Sometimes the voice that saves us belongs to someone we never expected to meet. Sometimes the answer to our deepest prayers arrives wearing a child's face and speaking words we didn't know we needed to hear. Sometimes the greatest wealth we can possess is the ability to recognize these moments of grace and let them change us in ways that money never could. Thank you for listening. Thank you for believing that stories like this matter, that hope is always worth holding on to, that every day offers new opportunities to choose love over fear, connection over isolation, generosity over hoarding our hearts. Until next time, may you be open to the small miracles, walking around in tennis shoes and tucked-in shirts, carrying backpacks full of wisdom and pockets full of wonder, ready to remind us all that the world is still full of goodness for those who have eyes to see it.